nice to be back again. It's been a few years. And I don't have any slides for you to show to you, so you'll have to just look at me and be satisfied with that. Before I actually start my talk, because I know once I get engrossed in the talk, I will forget to mention this, so if you'll indulge me for 10 seconds here. I have some flyers out on the tables. I sponsor the Joseph Campbell Roundtables in Venice Beach and Orange County, and we're looking for speakers. So please see me or email me if you're interested, and pick up one of these flyers if you want more information. And also my publisher has asked me to do another anthology. We're tentatively calling it Goddess 2.0, Rebooting the Sacred Feminine for the 21st Century. I have these flyers out there too. We're still taking submissions to the anthology, but we're looking for some, very specific things, social justice activism oriented. So that's why I thought this was the great audience to mention this to. So there's that. Now the talk I wanted to give to you today was the talk that I was asked to give at the Council for the Parliament of World Religions in October. And understand, when you're hearing this talk, it doesn't necessarily refer to the illustrious people sitting in this room. It applies more to, I think, the mainstream out there, not to sort of the academic bubble. And at the Council for the Parliament of World Religions, Goddess is still sort of the new kid on the block. So the rooms were filled at the Parliament, and I think when we get outside of our bubbles, there's an awful lot of people out there who still don't get what Goddess is. But even in our own community, what I find is we're all in different places, which some of the conversation already today has alluded to. So bear that in mind as I talk to you about the sacred feminine as liberation theology, because the last few years, what I have felt is very important is to reawaken our earliest sacred stories, particularly our pre-patriarchal sacred stories, to show how Goddess mythology has really always offered some templates for a more sustainable future. And the way this sort of came together for me, it was sort of a perfect storm, I think, of three things that got me going. And the first was a friend of mine left Goddess spirituality. She was a dear friend. She worked side by side with me and Roy as we ran the Isis Ancient Cultures Society for about 10 years and reconstructed ancient rituals for a modern context in public. Because, my thing has always been about rebirthing Goddess out in the world, not just keeping it in our living rooms. And she left Goddess spirituality, and she said the reason was she felt there wasn't enough substance there. Now, this was not, this girl was Mensa, okay? So she wasn't someone who wasn't, well-read. She, had been around the block a bit, but she just didn't think there was enough there with, and by that she meant, I think, she didn't feel like there was enough there being taught by leaders in the community about how we can use Goddess spirituality to make us better people, to make the world a better place. And then on my radio show, I had the honor of interviewing Margot Adler. And one of the things we chatted about rather extensively, I guess, was we lamented the fact that there weren't more pagans on the lines of social justice activism. And then the third thing, I think that came together with this perfect storm, was when the Dalai Lama said it would be Western women who would save the world. Well, I'll come back to the Dalai Lama in my closing points. But this made me start thinking, when we find Goddess, who who are our teachers? How are we finding goddess? And what became very clear to me, at least, from my perspective, the people that I was meeting, talking to, emailing me, stuff like that, it felt like there were two very distinct groups. There were the ones that came to it from Wicca, and then there were the ones that maybe came to it from feminist teachings. And sometimes the two crossed and sometimes they didn't, as we've said here. And I think, once you discover goddess, if you've been immersed in the big three patriarchal religions, I mean, there's just so much to discover. I mean, you have to learn, well, you don't have to, but you learn about goddess all around the world. I mean, that could take you a long time. You learn about doing ritual, you learn about energetics, maybe, you learn about symbolism. You start to think about your personal empowerment because you figure out that, well, gee, the divine isn't made in just a male image. So that can take you a lifetime, and you may not get beyond that. So you never maybe get to, I think, the feminist theology, feminist goddess theology, that goddess ideals can save the world. And for me, while I did sort of have one foot in the Wiccan community, I also had one foot in the feminist community, and I learned everything I knew, everything from the beginning, and probably one of the largest Dianic, witch groups in the country way back in the 90s. And even there was not any social justice activism going on. There was a political action circle that was defunct for the years that I was part of it. And so we never learned it there, is my point. It didn't penetrate. We were too busy doing fluff stuff, or the Goddess 1.0, Goddess 101 over and over and over and over again. And so that made me turn, I think, more to the feminist studies. And I had Riane Eisler's Chalice and the Blade and Merlin Stone, When God Was a Woman. Those were the two books, I think, that really set me on the path and made me understand that this wasn't just a feminist fantasy. And, then you start to understand, of course, that, mythology shapes our culture and our patriarchal society. If we have a male war god, then we end up with, all of the woes in society, the violent patriarchal society, domination, exploitation, oppression, economic exploitation particularly. And I think some people tend to underestimate the power of the mythology. And if someone does, I usually just bring up the Garden of Eden myth. Merlin Stone felt that the Garden of Eden myth was probably the first, or one of the first pieces of political propaganda that steered humanity away from women's leadership and goddess. And, and as time went on, we started getting away from the we and the us and, more into the, the I and the me, the rugged individualism mentality. And, it makes sense, that maybe mythology, to a certain extent, out in the mainstream was shoved aside because it's not the egalitarian or the pre-patriarchal mythology that's out there in the world. I mean, you think about what the mainstream person hears when they learn mythology. They don't know where to look to get the pre-patriarchal mythology or the stuff that we know about or learn about over the course of our study. They just hear about Hera, the petulant wife, chasing after her philandering husband. Aphrodite is maybe the boudoir babe, she's, about love and beauty, and, it doesn't go much deeper than that. Even the Hindu goddesses, our feminist scholars say they've been domesticated and spouseified. Or you have poor Mary, she's benign and passive with no sexuality. So, and Persephone, Persephone is, raped by Hades in the patriarchal myth, and abducted and kidnapped and brought down to the underworld. So if that's the mythology and that's pretty much what's out in the mainstream world, then is it any wonder our society has all the ills and woes that we have today? Women as second-class citizens, without pay equity, female genital mutilation, bride burning, and we're still fighting over our reproductive health, and if we can even have access to contraception, or if our employer can thwart that. I mean, it's insane. So, the goddesses became shadows of their former selves. Instead of creatrix of all, or the sea of being, we even had their life-giving capability taken away from goddess, taken away from the female, as it's co-opted by the males in patriarchy. So I'd like to just suggest, especially as academics, if you aren't already, or just to be cognizant of, maybe we can start reawakening, even reinterpreting and reclaiming some of the mythology of the sacred feminine. And, here's some of the ideas I'll just throw out there, and I'm sure some of you have thought about these yourselves, but remember, this is something I usually give to, this is a talk I usually give to people who've never heard this sort of thing before. The Demeter-Persephone myth, if you're familiar with the pre-patriarchal one that Charlene Spretnak wrote, Hades isn't even in the myth. Now, I realize there's an egalitarian myth of Persephone and Hades that comes along later, but let's just look at the pre-patriarchal myth of Demeter and Persephone. When I teach the course Cakes for the Queen of Heaven, in the curriculum, when that's presented, we look at, all right, what is that teaching us? It's teaching us more about the relationship between a mother and a daughter. And when I teach cakes, I extrapolate that and take it a step further and say, okay, it's about relationships between mothers and daughters, that they have healthier relationships. The mother has to let the daughter go to live her own life and that kind of thing. But, we're all either mothers or daughters if we're women. And I like to extrapolate that into, it's about women supporting women, getting away from this women's inhumanity to women. And, that can be used, I think, as, a metaphor or an analogy for promoting, more cooperation, more solidarity out there among women, and we certainly need it. Sedna, for instance, the Inuit goddess, one of her myths has her as the gatekeeper between men and the creatures of the sea. Men rely on the creatures of the sea for their food, for their weapons, for their clothing, but Sedna says you only take what you need. If you get greedy, I'm going to cut you off and then you have nothing. So Sedna, that version of the myth, is a perfect example of something we can use to speak against exploitation and greed. Isis. Isis has loads of stuff you can use for Isis. Her symbol is the throne, okay? Female leadership, right there. If you want to talk partnership, what better partnership than Isis and Osiris? It's been said that they created civilization and men and women to love one another. Also, too, she's been a single mother. So you can take the stigma off of being a single mother, Jeb Bush. And also, too, she's been a widow. How many vulnerable widows do we have out there in some cultures? So Isis is has a rich mythology for creating new ideals out there in the mainstream world. Mary Magdalene. I honestly think the Mary Magdalene people are ahead of the curve, and they have been retelling the story of Mary Magdalene for a long time. Okay, Mary Magdalene and Jesus, they're the sacred feminine and divine masculine. There's no problem with her having, being sexual. It's about wholeness, it's about unity, it's about partnership. Oftentimes you'll even see these images of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and she has a pregnant belly. what a great Trinity, myth or metaphor